Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole's initial hypothesis on the Boston Strangler case was that the serial killer had only targeted women, particularly those who were living alone. The women's concerns were consistently ignored. It's possible that the initial few murders in Michigan had nothing to do with the ones in Boston. But, the movie decides to use that artistic license as a means of highlighting Loretta's difficulties, which are further highlighted when news reports about Loretta and Jean's work as members of the investigation team surface. Also, it is revealed that detectives from New York and Michigan had made contact with Boston police. Sadly, the murder division did not return their calls or consider their arguments that a single serial killer was responsible for this. The investigator from Michigan PD finally informed Loretta of the accusations regarding Boston PD, which prompted her to compile a report. As a result of the huge controversy, the commissioner was suspended and the attorney general took over the investigation. Additionally, it led to the Boston PD designating Loretta and Jean as persona non grata. The situation got so terrible that Loretta was finally unsure of whether the stalker she saw through her window was a real serial killer or just an irate police officer. The assignment offered to two female reporters in the 1960s is a photo opportunity, as Loretta and Jean are also aware of. Their private lives are made public because of the publication of their photos in the media. At her home, Loretta started getting unusual phone calls, which upset her husband. When she told Jean about these incidents, Jean disclosed that she had to take her number off the phone book years ago because of her job, an occupation that Loretta only recently joined after working on the lifestyle beat. Nonetheless, the movie also shows Loretta executing the majority of the daring actions by herself. She looks for the recently departed person's ex-boyfriend, who she finds to be weird and possessive. When she arrived at the ex-house, boyfriend's Daniel Marsh, she instantly felt uneasy because Marsh ordered her to wait in the other room at the opposite end of the house while the house itself appeared to be gloomy and moldy. Loretta quickly finds an explanation and exits that residence after believing her gut feeling. Daniel Marsh is detained by the police on suspicion of murder much later in the movie. One of the other victims is having an affair with her boss, a powerful industrialist, according to Jean. The deceased was found to be carrying the industrialist's child, providing him a good reason to kill her. Too gradually, Loretta's personal life begins to unravel. While her husband James, Morgan Spector, initially showed support by taking on the duties of caring for their children in the house, their relationship soon begins to deteriorate as a result of Loretta being required by the investigation to work long hours and leave the office at odd hours, which interferes with family gatherings. Also, it didn't help that society's general skepticism of women wanting to work outside the home was consistent with James' sister's perception of Loretta working from home. We are treated to a dialogue between Jean and her husband in one moment, despite the fact that Jean's personal life had not been thoroughly addressed in the movie. It makes it clear that Jean, in contrast to Loretta and James, has experience as an investigative journalist, which influences her husband's reluctant acceptance of the situation. As a result, they are able to support one another even when their marriage is under stress. In one of the film's few instances of tension, Loretta also gets death threats in the form of letters that include newspaper clippings of images of her and Jean with red crosses over them. Albert DeSalvo, David Dastmalchian, one of the main suspects in this case, began to surface as the inquiry went on because he was already a known sex offender in the region. During their investigation, the two women learned that the tricks DeSalvo would employ to enter the women's rooms were the same ones the murderer had employed as a pretext for admission. Despite Detective Crowley's, Alessandro Nivola, denials that DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler because he was incarcerated at the time of the murders, Loretta is adamant that he is. Loretta and Jean find out through the documents that DeSalvo was given an early release 2 months prior to the killings starting. By publishing this piece, the department is forced to detain DeSalvo. Crowley assisted Loretta in making sure an identity test with the woman who nearly became a victim was set up. The lineup included the addition of DeSalvo and a few additional inmates. Yet instead of pointing to DeSalvo, the woman pointed to George Nasser, another prisoner. The police decided not to provide the test's results to the public, therefore it was all for nothing. DeSalvo did, however, confess fully in a locked room, and he acknowledged being responsible for all 13 killings. The problem was that he had managed to secure the services of renowned defense attorney F. Lee Bailey, who had agreed to record DeSalvo's confession in exchange for the department not using it in court. As a result, the Boston police would close the investigation and DeSalvo would face trial for rape and other offenses but not for the murder. The announcements made by the Boston police that the case had been resolved and that the offender had been apprehended and would spend a significant amount of time in jail did not sit well with the families of the victims or with Loretta herself. She wanted to expose the all-too-obvious misconduct and inefficiency of the Boston Police Department, but her editor and Jean, who had already accepted another job, prevented her. In the meantime, Loretta spoke with Crowley, who had quit the Boston Police Department after growing tired of his position. He first denied Loretta's theory that he already had a copy of the DeSalvo recording, but the following day she discovers copies of the recording on her desk, the package with the inscription, "For my sister Sally," the name Crowley had suggested Loretta used to get in touch with him. Loretta and Jean listened to the recording and recognized that the attorney had shown DeSalvo images of the crime scene in order to make sure the confession was accurate. These mistakes made by DeSalvo were already documented. When Loretta persuaded DeSalvo's brother to assist her, she was eventually able to get in touch with DeSalvo. DeSalvo consented to speak with her while in custody but was killed later that evening. Loretta was finally told the name of another prisoner during a visit to this facility, George Nassar, the same man who had shared a cell with Daniel Marsh and DeSalvo. Nassar admits that the entire confession was a ruse to earn money, $10,000 each victim, for Nassar and his lawyer, particularly the money offered in exchange for delivering solid evidence in the Boston Strangler case. Loretta finally sits across from Nassar and asks him the truth. DeSalvo consented to the confession after being promised a book deal by his attorney, which would have brought in millions of dollars. As a result, Nassar killed him to keep the facts hidden. Both in the movie and in real life, the Boston Strangler case was never fully resolved. The Boston Strangler idea, wherein many murderers use the moniker in order to further their own goals, is emphasized throughout the film. This, according to the film, demonstrates how the killings changed over time and how their methods and victims' ages varied. The commentary, Boston Strangler, makes about how that singular identity of the Boston Strangler as a psychopathic lunatic is a safer option for the anxious general public than acknowledging the fundamental truth about how the violence of a man killing a woman has sadly occurred with alarming regularity is an interesting and incisive one. Albert DeSalvo was ultimately connected to the 13th and final victim through DNA tests in 2013, but the other homicides are still unsolved. According to the text and pictures of the real women, Loretta kept working as a writer and eventually rose to the position of award-winning medical reporter at the Boston Globe. In the 1980s, she was one of the first journalists to cover the HIV/AIDS catastrophe. James and her marriage did not last, and they ultimately divorced. Throughout the subsequent 30 years, Jean Cole remained an investigative journalist and personal friend of Loretta. George Nassar is one of the few people connected to the Boston Strangler case who is still alive and is incarcerated. Yet he never succeeded in collecting the substantial payout from Albert DeSalvo's confession. Do you enjoy the video? Kindly subscribe, like, share and comment for more videos.